September 3, 1939. Berlin, the Reich Chancellery. As Britain's declaration of war was delivered to Adolf Hitler's government, the reaction inside Germany's political and military leadership was not panic, but irritation. To many senior figures within the Wehrmacht, Britain's decision to stand alone alongside France felt less like a strategic threat and more like an emotional gesture from a declining empire clinging to its past. In the early months of the war, Germany did not view Britain as a decisive military opponent. It viewed Britain as an obstacle that would eventually step aside. This belief was rooted in experience, ideology, and selective memory. Germany's generals remembered the First World War not as a British victory, but as a war lost to blockade, exhaustion, and internal collapse. The British Army of 1914 to 1918 had been small by continental standards, and even at its peak relied heavily on French manpower. By 1939, Britain still maintained a relatively small standing army, scattered across imperial commitments from India to the Middle East. To the Wehrmacht's planners, this confirmed an old assumption. Britain was a naval power first, a colonial administrator second, and a land power only as a last resort. German intelligence assessments reinforced this view. Reports emphasized Britain's political divisions, economic strain from the Great Depression, and what Nazi ideology described as a society softened by democracy and comfort. The rapid fall of Poland in September 1939 and the crushing defeat of France in June 1940 appeared to validate these assumptions. France, with its large army and formidable defenses, had collapsed in 6 weeks. Britain, now isolated, seemed even less capable of prolonged resistance. Yet this confidence masked a fundamental misunderstanding. The Wehrmacht judged Britain through the narrow lens of continental warfare, measuring divisions, tanks, and immediate battlefield strength. It underestimated Britain's strategic depth, institutional resilience, and ability to wage long wars. German planners assumed Britain would negotiate once France fell, either recognizing Germany's dominance in Europe or accepting a subordinate role. When this did not happen, Berlin interpreted British defiance not as strategy, but as stubbornness. The evacuation at Dunkirk in late May and early June 1940 reinforced this misreading. Although over 300,000 Allied troops escaped, the Wehrmacht viewed the operation as a British defeat disguised as propaganda. The loss of equipment, the abandonment of the continent, and the image of soldiers retreating across the Channel all seemed to confirm German beliefs that Britain lacked the will to fight alone. What Germany failed to recognize was that Britain was not preparing to win quickly. It was preparing to endure. That endurance would shape the war in ways the Wehrmacht neither anticipated nor adequately planned for, setting the stage for a series of costly miscalculations that would echo across Europe for the next 6 years. By the summer of 1940, this German assumption of British fragility collided with reality in the skies over southern England. Operation Sea Lion, the proposed invasion of Britain, depended on one prerequisite: air superiority. The Wehrmacht believed this condition could be achieved quickly. The Luftwaffe, fresh from victories in Poland, Norway, the Low Countries, and France, regarded the Royal Air Force as a smaller, technically inferior force that would be destroyed within weeks. German planners calculated aircraft numbers and concluded that attrition would favor Germany. What they failed to understand was how Britain had structured its air defense system. Britain's strength did not lie solely in aircraft numbers. It lay in integration. Radar stations along the coast, known as chain home, provided early warning. Information flowed into fighter command's centralized control rooms, where aircraft were dispatched with precision rather than wasted in continuous patrols. This system allowed Britain to fight economically, conserving pilots and machines while forcing the Luftwaffe to operate at the limits of its range. German intelligence was aware of radar installations but underestimated their operational impact, viewing them as experimental rather than decisive. Equally damaging was the Wehrmacht's misreading of British morale. The fall of France had convinced Berlin that British civilian resistance would crack under sustained bombing. Early Luftwaffe strategy focused on airfields, aircraft factories, and radar stations. When these attacks failed to destroy fighter command, frustration set in. The shift toward bombing London and other cities in September 1940 was not merely retaliatory. It reflected a belief that Britain's social fabric was brittle and that civilian pressure would force political collapse. Instead, the bombing campaign hardened British resolve. Industrial output continued. Aircraft production increased rather than declined. Pilots shot down over Britain often returned to service within days, while German aircrews lost over England became prisoners of war. The Luftwaffe's losses mounted quietly but steadily, eroding its experienced core. By October 1940, Germany had failed to secure air superiority. Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely, though never formally cancelled. This failure marked the first major strategic reversal of the war for the Wehrmacht. It demonstrated that Britain could absorb punishment, adapt tactics, and sustain resistance even when isolated. Yet German leadership did not revise its broader assessment. Instead of recognizing Britain as a durable adversary, Hitler increasingly dismissed it as a secondary problem, to be neutralized later through blockade, air attack, or diplomatic isolation. That misjudgment carried consequences far beyond the English Channel. Britain's survival preserved a base for resistance, intelligence coordination, and future offensives. It also ensured that Germany would never fight a single-front war. The decision to look east toward the Soviet Union was made in the shadow of Britain's continued defiance, not despite it. In underestimating Britain's ability to endure, the Wehrmacht set itself on a strategic path that would stretch German resources across multiple theaters, with no easy way back. With Britain still in the war, the Wehrmacht now faced a strategic problem it had not planned to solve quickly: how to defeat an island power that could not be finished by a short land campaign, yet could still influence the continent through sea power, air power, and intelligence. German strategy turned increasingly toward economic warfare. In 1940 and 1941, German planners believed that U-boats and mines could sever Britain's maritime lifelines and force surrender through starvation of fuel, food, and raw materials. Britain imported a large share of what it consumed and what it needed to fight. On paper, this looked like a vulnerability that could be exploited decisively. But once again, the Wehrmacht underestimated how Britain had organized for prolonged conflict. The convoy system, refined from the First World War, limited the ability of submarines to pick off merchant ships at will. British and Allied escort forces expanded steadily, including corvettes, destroyers, and later escort carriers, while improved detection methods such as ASTIC and increasingly effective radar reduced the U-boat's freedom of movement. Germany's submariners achieved frightening successes, especially during periods when escort coverage was thin, but they were fighting a race of production and adaptation they could not control. Britain did not need to eliminate the U-boat threat overnight. It needed to keep enough shipping alive long enough for its countermeasures, shipbuilding, and alliances to mature. The same pattern appeared in Britain's role as a coordinating hub for the wider war. The island became a secure base for planning, training, and equipping forces that Germany could not reach with ground armies. British intelligence, working with allies, expanded surveillance of German communications, tracked shipping, and built an increasingly sophisticated picture of German order of battle across Europe. Even when German armies controlled vast territories, the Wehrmacht could not fully suppress the flow of information, the pressure of blockade, or the long-term consequences of Britain remaining an active belligerent. In the Mediterranean, Germany's decision to support Italy created another arena where Britain could impose costs. British naval and air forces fought to keep routes open to Egypt and the Middle East, while German resources were pulled into North Africa and the central Mediterranean. These campaigns did not decide the war alone, but they forced Germany into continual commitments beyond its original continental focus. By underestimating Britain, the Wehrmacht misread the nature of the war it had created. It expected Britain to collapse, negotiate, or become strategically irrelevant. Instead, Britain functioned as a persistent platform for resistance, alliance building, and the slow accumulation of power that would eventually return to the continent in force. As Britain settled into the role of an unsinkable base and a strategic coordinator, the conflict began to shift from a test of immediate battlefield power to a test of endurance, production, and alliances, exactly the kind of long war the Wehrmacht had not planned to fight. One of Germany's costliest misjudgments was treating Britain's global connections as secondary. Britain's empire and sea routes mattered, but even more decisive was Britain's ability to turn resistance into partnership. From 1940 onward, Britain worked to keep the war international, sustaining ties with governments in exile, supporting resistance networks, and, most importantly, binding its survival to American industry and finance. Lend-Lease, launched in 1941, did not instantly solve Britain's shortages, but it created a pipeline of supplies, fuel, food, and equipment that strengthened Britain's staying power at the very moment Germany expected collapse. The Atlantic Charter signaled political alignment, and joint planning began well before American troops landed in Europe. The Wehrmacht, focused on campaigns it could measure in maps and divisions, underestimated what Britain was building behind the scenes: an integrated Allied war machine. In the Atlantic, Britain's convoy system and escort expansion increasingly intersected with American shipbuilding and escort production, narrowing the window in which U-boats could dictate strategy. In the air, Britain became a launchpad for an escalating bombing campaign against German industry and transport networks. Whatever debate existed about bombing's efficiency, the strategic reality for Germany was unavoidable. Britain's survival meant German factories, rail yards, and fuel infrastructure would remain under growing pressure while German resources were already stretched across multiple fronts. This mattered because it shaped German decisions in Europe. German forces occupying the continent now had to guard long coastlines against a threat that would not disappear. The Wehrmacht was forced into a defensive geometry it had never wanted: static fortifications, dispersed garrisons, and constant readiness against raids, deception, and invasion threats. Every division held in France, the Low Countries, or Norway was a division not available elsewhere, and every ton of concrete poured into coastal defenses was a ton not used for other war needs. By underestimating Britain, Germany created a war in which time worked against it. Britain did not need to defeat the Wehrmacht in a single stroke. It only needed to remain in the fight long enough for Allied power, industrial, naval, air, and eventually land, to accumulate into something Germany could no longer parry. The clearest proof that the Wehrmacht had misread Britain came when the war returned to the continent in a form Germany had tried to prevent since 1940. A sustained, combined arms offensive launched from British soil and coordinated across multiple Allied commands. By 1943, Britain was no longer merely surviving. It was shaping the tempo of the war. Amphibious operations in North Africa and the Mediterranean had already demonstrated an Allied ability to project power, and by early 1944 Britain had become the central staging ground for the largest invasion force in modern history. This was not simply a buildup of men and vehicles. It was an industrial and logistical system. Ports expanded, airfields multiplied, pipelines planned, rail lines repaired, and entire armies trained for a single purpose: returning to Western Europe with overwhelming material support. The Wehrmacht did not ignore this threat, but it struggled to respond to it effectively because its earlier assumptions had forced it into reactive decisions. German strategy in the West became defensive and often confused because it could not agree where the blow would fall. Deception measures fed this uncertainty, but the deeper problem was structural. Germany had to defend too much coastline with too many competing priorities, while also feeding the demands of the Eastern Front. British and Allied air power intensified the pressure. Rail networks, bridges, repair depots, airfields, and fuel infrastructure were attacked repeatedly, forcing Germany to move reinforcements under constant threat and reducing the mobility that had once defined Blitzkrieg. On June 6, 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, Britain's underestimated strengths became visible in practical terms. The invasion depended on naval escort, air cover, engineering, and a supply system designed to keep armies moving once ashore. The German army fought hard, and local counterattacks were often fierce, but the Wehrmacht faced an opponent it had not expected in 1939. A Britain that had absorbed years of pressure, reorganized its military, coordinated with allies, and transformed its island position into operational leverage. What followed was not a rapid collapse, but a grinding shift in balance. German commanders repeatedly complained about Allied air dominance and artillery weight. The Western Front became another drain on German manpower and fuel at the worst possible time. And the crucial point was this: the Wehrmacht was now paying for an earlier failure of imagination. Britain had not simply refused to quit. It had stayed in the war long enough to turn survival into strategic initiative. In the end, the Wehrmacht's underestimation of Britain was not a single mistake. but a pattern that ran from the first declaration of war to the collapse of German forces in Europe. German leaders saw Britain as a fading imperial power that might fight briefly but could not sustain an industrial conflict. They measured Britain by divisions on the continent and colonial commitments overseas, and misread what mattered most: the capacity to endure, adapt, and mobilize allies. Britain's refusal to negotiate after the fall of France kept a hostile power on Germany's western flank, just as Berlin sought freedom of action in the east. The failure to destroy Fighter Command preserved British airspace and turned the island into a launch platform for growing air and sea campaigns. In the Atlantic, convoy systems, escort groups, and Allied shipbuilding gradually blunted the U-boat threat that had seemed capable of starving Britain into submission. Across the Mediterranean and later in Northwest Europe, British and Commonwealth forces, often alongside American troops, forced the Wehrmacht to commit formations to fronts that drained fuel and manpower. Each year that Britain stayed in the war, German options narrowed. By underestimating Britain, Germany helped create the coalition it most needed to avoid: a partnership with the time and production to wear down a continental dictatorship. Britain did not defeat the Wehrmacht alone, and its campaigns contained failures and costly misjudgments. But its decision to stand, its ability to adapt, and its role as a base for Allied power ensured that Germany paid for its early contempt across Europe. If you found this examination helpful, please consider liking the video, subscribing for more World War II documentaries, and telling us in the comments which battle or campaign you would like next.